Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, hosted by me, Suzifeay. I've got my puffin book bag on the go there. I've got my Smarties mug, got quite a jazzy top on. We will be talking about kids' books for the next hour or so, something very dear to my heart. I must be one of the oldest reviewers of young adult fiction out there, so I still keep an eye on that section of the market. But I am inviting into the book bag a true expert and a very good friend. Welcome into my book bag. Welcome, come through the back of the wardrobe into my magical world. Welcome, Sam Leith.
Thank you for having me, Suzi. It's a delight to be here.
And this is what we're going to be talking about. And look at the size of this book.
Yeah, it was longer than I'd intended, but turns out it's a big subject.
Right, okay. Were you kind of thinking, I can knock this off in sort of 300 pages?
Well, not really, but I was contracted to do 120,000 words, and it sort of got a bit longer. And then I handed it in and said, it's a bit long. And they went, no, that's all right. It'll be better to have it longer because it'll seem more authoritative. And then I was in a marketing meeting. I said, out of interest, how long does it come out when you put it into actual pages? And they went, about 550, 600. And I practically fell off my chair.
Yes.
All my previous books would be quite short.
Nobody needs to sort of survey this field again for a little while. You've kind of covered a heck of a lot.
Oh, well, I hope so.
And it's a wonderful read. And knowing you as I do, it's got your touches of wit and your little asides and your footnotes. So it's very good fun to read. It's not sort of dry and dusty whatsoever. A History of Childhood Reading is the subtitle. Please explain the title, The Haunted Wood.
Well, the title is a quotation from W.H. Auden's September 1st, 1939, which you'll...
Who have never been happy or good.
Exactly. Children lost in a haunted wood, children afraid of the night who have never been happy or good. And partly that was because I'm an Auden super fan, and it was an opportunity to use Auden as an epigraph. As $100 never better spent.
Of course, he's in copyright. Okay.
Yeah, he's in copyright, alas. But it also seemed to me to dovetail a lot with the themes of the book, because that idea, that poem, as you will know very well, is picturing Auden sitting in a bar in New York on the very eve of the Second World War. One of the dives at the end of a low, dishonest decade. And Auden, in that poem, is describing how, at a time of great adult peril, we're suddenly exposed as the children we have always been, and that... there's that kind of sense of the adult and the child, because I was very concerned through this book to keep in sight what is, of course, blindingly obvious, but still, needs restating, which is that children's books are written by adults. And so at every turn, what they give you is a sense of adult preoccupations about childhood, adult ideas about childhood, their ideas about what they think children need, how they imagine children are. And so children's literature is a point at which adults and children kind of meet. And that it's not just kids stuff, that it's a pretty kind of, oh, look, the sound of ambulances taking off. And I thought that was something that was very interesting, and it feeds into, a theme of the book, which is that, a lot of the people who wrote children's literature were quite odd characters. Childhood was unfinished business for them, and there's a lot of pain and bereavement and loss and grief and trauma that runs behind and underneath the often completely delightful productions of these books for children, but also. The haunted wood is archetypal, as Auden used it. It's the wood in every Middle European fairy tale, which is the place at the center of which is the gingerbread house or Baba Yaga's chicken-legged hut. And, another argument of the book is that children's stories remain, I think, very much closer to those sort of basic forms of storytelling that we find in folk tales and fairy tales and myths. And, the Haunted Wood is a place where it's a little bit scary and it's a little bit exciting, and you kind of come back changed, as in every fairy tale. And that, again, I thought was a really important kind of guiding star for the themes of this book.
I mean, it's even in Shakespeare. It's the place where transformation and magic happens. You go there. And as
exactly, and I think that's which is fascinating to me, that these basic sort of original forms of storytelling, which literary fiction kind of tries to get away from in some ways. We know that the roots of it all are in those folk tales and in myths, and they come out in Shakespeare, they come out in their kind of domesticated form in fairy tales. But still, going off into the wood, that's where the wolves are.
There's a sense throughout the book. I mean, it's not a history of childhood per se, but at the same time, you do tackle different views of what is a child. And even to begin with, are children a separate demographic at all? Are they a separate class of people who need different sort of books? I mean, it seems to me that this is part of the argument as you go through. That is it the changing ideas that adults have about children?
Yes, I think so. And I'm glad you picked up on that, because there is a sense in which the history of children's literature is the history of childhood. It's a history of adult conceptions of childhood, and it's profoundly shaped by those. Now, there was a kind of theory that was sort of fashionable in like the 1970s with the French historian Philippe Ariès and later the early modernist Lawrence Stone, that basically said, it's like that kind of Harold Bloom idea that, we didn't have any lives till Shakespeare invented them. The idea that there was no such thing as children until, the early modern period, and, childhood itself didn't exist. And I think that is, to use the kind of historiographical term, complete bollocks. But it points to something that is sort of true, which is that the sort of way childhood, as we conceptualize it now, was understood, isn't something that's gone back all the way. I mean, in medieval times, in classical times, a child was sort of a defective adult. The job was to get a child through childhood as quickly as possible, and as soon as you were old enough to, look after your younger siblings, or go up a chimney, or jump into a cotton mill and get pneumoconiosis, or if you were posh, marry the Infanta and cement a dynastic alliance. That was what you were going to do. And in order to have children's literature, you kind of need separate spaces in which these stories would be told, because obviously way back when, the archetypal storytelling situation is the folk tale, which is for everyone. You're in the mouth of a cave, or in your hut, or your mammoth bone tent, or whatever. And, children and adults are very much mixed. They don't have a separate space. So you need things like a nursery, or, as later came on, a school. So, for us to really be away to the races, which is the middle of the 19th century, you need children who can kind of read, and a separate space and conceptualization of children. And so you need to stop sending them up chimneys and start sending them to school. And this idea that there's a kind of privileged space between, 7 and 16, or 7 and 14, or whatever it is, between kind of late childhood and adolescence, which is sort of marked out, becomes very important, and a space in which play is encouraged and imagination is encouraged. And obviously what children were is a site of contestation. That's why before the 19th century, you have this, I've got a sort of chapter of the kind of hair-raising children's stories that basically it was in the hands of the Puritans. There's one critic who described them as Calvinists of unrelenting severity, which, if you think about it, makes sense. That for a period of time, when Calvinism and sort of Puritanism were on the up, the basic premise was that every child born into the world started out kind of radioactive with original sin. Mm-hmm. And so the job of any story you were telling a child, or any kind of instruction or education you were giving to a child, was to save their souls. And this was kind of a non-trivial thing. They were going to go to hell unless they accepted Jesus and were shriven of original sin. And so basically children's stories at that point were extremely terrifying. The idea was the way you saved them from original sin was scare the shit out of them. So the kind of like wonderful instance of that, which was a huge bestseller, it was the Gruffalo of its day, was A Token for Children by this nonconformist preacher halfway through the 17th century called James Janeway, which is basically a kind of snuff anthology. 14 children who go gratefully to their makers, and as they're breathing their last, aged 8 or whatever, go, oh, my little playmates, lose no time playing knucklebones or running up and down upon the Sabbath, but get on my knees and pray to Jesus. And then they die gratefully and they go to their maker, and that's the end. Kind of quite severe. So the idea that children's literature could or should be fun took a little while to catch on. We swung the other way with the Romantics.
Is it? Oh, yes. Well, I was going to say the Victorians, but of course the Romantics had the sort of cult of childhood via Rousseau.
Yes, you get Rousseau and Locke, who start to say, look, childhood is a thing in itself. It's not a thing to be got through. It has its own properties, and those properties are delight in play and experimentation and a closeness to nature. And the Romantics kind of picked that up and ran with it. And Locke and Rousseau also said, look, the way to educate children is not to kind of scare them or beat them. It's to make it fun. There's some lovely stuff in Locke where he says, maybe you could make a sort of game that would help to teach children the alphabet, or you can, dice that would have alphabetic letters on them. And so it was much more like, okay, how do we work with the grain of children's natures, and what is that nature? And the Romantics took that up and ran with it. And so suddenly you went from children being these kind of avatars of evil and wickedness who had to be purged, to children being these sort of sainted innocents, which again, as anyone who's got or had or ever met a child will know,
or been one,
a bit of a distortion of facts. So you get these very sentimental and sort of saccharine late Victorian stories, which are all about how children are rebuked to the fallen adult world. And it's only really a bit later on that you suddenly start to see children as we recognize them, not evil, not saintly, but kind of, naughty and energetic and interesting.
So I've got my puffin bag, as I mentioned, and this immediately took me back to Saturdays when I was a kid, going to the market hall with my grandparents, and there was a little bookstore with that wall of puffins, with the colour-coded spines.
I was a member of the Puffin Club. I expect you were too.
I was not a member of the Puffin Club. No. I did read an awful lot of puffins. So I would get a little... it would be Enid Blyton. I was just one of those kids. I was not advanced in my reading at all. I read all the time, but I did read Enid Blyton. Yeah, I wasn't one of those kids. So I'd get my Enid Blyton. This might be sort of Friday afternoon or something, or even Saturday, and I would have finished it by Sunday. And I once was taken to have my ears tested because they thought I might be deaf, because once I had this here, nothing went in whatsoever. But I remember my grandma going, it's a waste of money. It's a waste of money. You tear through them so fast. I think she had this idea, a bit like the boy with the chocolate who just eats a little tiny bit every day. I think the idea was, I was somehow wasting money by reading them so fast.
Well, given that your distinguished later career as literary editor, you certainly weren't.
Exactly.
But no, I had exactly the same thing. My little brother claims that for the first 8 years of his life, he thought his name was Fuck Off, I'm Reading.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I remember very vividly, and this is again my grandparents with whom I spent quite a lot of time, they were always trying to tip me out of doors. You know, the sun is shining, put that book down and go. And I was like, oh God, what am I going to do? I'm just going to mope around on the lawn.
Yeah.
You know, like
couldn't agree more. I think they're still in the grip of Rousseau, though. That's the problem.
It was sort of seen as a bit of a problem. Like, well, you know, all this reading is very problematic. And I don't think parents would be like that now. They wouldn't necessarily see it was problematic.
No, so we still do have the, you know, get off that computer game and go and run around in the park thing. Mm-hmm. I think this Rousseauian idea that childhood has to be associated with nature, which goes through the history of children's literature. You know, they're all just like the Romantics, kind of lamenting the Industrial Revolution and urbanization. You know, we mentioned Blyton. You know, none of Blyton's stories really are set in the city. They're all, you know, in some idealized version of the English countryside. And that, I think, is a really strong inheritance. It goes right back to Rousseau, this idea that childhood is associated with nature and the outdoors and, you know, larking around, climbing apple trees and all that sort of nonsense. Obviously, for you and me, childhood is hiding behind a curtain, reading a Terence Dick's Doctor Who novelization. Never did me any harm.
Yeah, that's another thing that I never did. When is it the Victorians that we really start to get fantasy going and associating, you know, talking animals or whatever, or unicorns with children's literature?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a sort of, obviously, right back at the beginning of children's literature, there's Aesop. And we know, you know, most folk tales, whether they're sort of descended from Aesop or not, tend to have talking animals or animal helpers. You know, we get 3 bears and cunning foxes and, you know, wolves, you know, cross-dressing and so forth.
Yeah.
I don't think, though, that the sort of fantasy animals that appear in children's literature in the late 19th and early 20th century are directly from Aesop, because those ones are normally kind of, you know, avatars of something a bit numinous. And you get some, I think Beatrix Potter is a huge part of it. I mean, I think Beatrix Potter's like, because her animals are really, sometimes they're like animals and sometimes they're like little, you know, Victorian housefrows. You know, they're sort of quite bourgeois Victorian characters in animal drag a lot of the time. So I think she's one strand of it. The fantasy thing, which I think kind of you could say goes back to Alice, in that, you know, the Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which are, they're very sui generis sort of fantasy, but that kind of like you go down the rabbit hole into another world and everything's extraordinarily weird, which obviously, you know, goes through the whole history of children's literature. You know, those portal fantasies. You go through a wardrobe, you go down a rabbit hole, you're off to Narnia, whatever it is. You know, that sort of starts with Alice, but the fantasy of the wizards and goblins sort, I mean, I think that's kind of sort of in its really germinal form is in the Princess and the Goblin by
Is that MacDonald Fraser?
George MacDonald, I think. And that's
George MacDonald.
MacDonald Fraser is the Flashman stuff, isn't he?
Oh, that's right. That's right. I have read The Princess and the Goblin.
It's really weird. It's brilliant. I mean, kind of, because it's a sort of fairy tale, but it mocks fairy tale conventions. And it's about this princess who's sort of lonely in a castle, and she wanders the corridor and she finds a kind of woman who claims to be her great-great-grandmother, who lives on pigeons' eggs in some weird corner of the loft. And then it turns out there's a crew of goblins who were displaced from their ancestral home by the humans and are nursing a grudge, and are keen to and there's sort of miners who are quite close to the goblins because they go down into the hill and they can hear the goblins' tunnels next door. And anyway, the goblins hatch a plot to undermine the castle and kill the humans and kidnap the princess, and various very wacky and quite violent things happen. But that sort of register of fantasy, I think, you know, what turns into, you know, people like Tolkien and Lewis, owes a debt to MacDonald. It's kind of bridge between fairy tales and what we think of as modern fantasy.
When you were writing this book as an adult about children and about children's literature, I mean, did that send you back to you as a child and what you wanted from fiction?
Well, it did. I mean, one of the great pleasures of the book was revisiting stuff that made a big impression on me as a kid. I was like, well, yeah, Nicholas Fiske's definitely going to be in there. And, T.H. White, I remembered reading The Sword in the Stone as a kid. And when I came back to T.H. White as an adult, seeing how rich and complex and full of jokes that, while the story works for children, there are sort of smutty jokes in there, and there are some poignant reflections on, love and lovelessness and, the duties of kingship and being cuckolded and all sorts of stuff that's quite adult. And lots of just really, really funny jokes and shifts in register. I was like, oh my God, there's so much more in here. And so it was lovely to come back and see what was available in things I'd loved and be confirmed that, yes, I loved these as a child, but I'm seeing so much more in them. And obviously, I think, which makes sense, again, if you follow the thesis that a lot of children's writers are writing as adults for their inner child or from their inner child. Quite a lot of the stuff that hits hardest hits adults harder. When you think of because the deep theme of a lot of these books is time and growing up, and the fact that as a child, you're changing. You go into the haunted wood, you come back changed. You have an adventure which transforms you. And when you think of, say, the famous tearjerkers, the closing lines of The House at Pooh Corner, or the closing lines of Philippa Pierce's wonderful time-split novel, Tom's Midnight Garden, adults have a sense of the fleetingness of time and the irrevocability of growing up that children don't.
They're in the moment.
They're in the moment. And so there's a sort of double vision you get in a lot of these stories, where there's the adult seeing, this is poignant in a way that a child will get, but probably not get so much until they are in the position of the old lady at the end of Tom's Midnight Garden, rather than just the kid. And indeed, as a friend of mine, I remember marking, Neil Gaiman's novel Coraline, which is a sort of, is it YA? No, it's a bit younger than YA, I think. About, this little girl who finds a door in her house, which leads into a kind of funny reverse version of her own house, in which there's another mother with buttons for eyes, who gives her nice things to play with and wants her to stay forever. And as a friend of mine said, the thing is, adults find this fucking terrifying in a way that children don't, because you as an adult sort of know what, or have some apprehension of quite how great the threat implied in this fantasy world is. So that double vision is part of what made it interesting for me. But the other thing I say is that because I was quite a precocious kid, I got onto adult books quite fast. And so a lot of the time I was able to come back and read things I missed first time round with enormous pleasure and admiration. So E. Nesbit, I'm ashamed to say, I never read as a kid. And, she's a stone cold genius. So come to that. And I think, and I go along with Catherine Rundle here and her, why you should read children's books, even though you're so old and wise, is that there's the idea that children's books haven't got anything in them for adult readers is nonsense. They, they contain a huge amount for adults and children alike, and can be read with pleasure and fulfillment by adults. It doesn't, they're not lesser than the adult version.
How much G.A. Henty did you read?
Oh, he had to be in there. G.A. Henty, for listeners or viewers who aren't familiar with his work, was this huge bestseller. I mean, he was kind of late Victorian I don't know what the equivalent would be, because he wrote hundreds of thousands, millions and millions of words of imperial adventure stories and historical fantasies or historical adventure stories, which were like incredibly badly put together and hastily written, and sold God knows how many copies. I mean, he was just like mutton chop Victorian imperialist. He described it sat at his desk, writing away with 2 or 3 history books open, smoking furiously.
There's a great description, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a lovely description he wrote of how he wrote. He said how he write books for boys.
I might be able to find it actually, because it did make. I probably can't. Okay, I'm going to read this bit. I think it's super funny.
Henty at work. How you
imagine me with mutton chops.
Yeah.
When I get to the purely historical part, I have 3 or 4 history books open before me, and I insist particularly that all my history shall be absolutely unassailable. I dictate every word. In that way, I think you obtain larger, finer sentences. And I smoke the whole time. My work is extremely rapidly done. On more than one occasion, I have completed a book of 140,000 words in 20 days.
I know. That is Mike Moorcock.
That's a process.
Productivity. That's a process. But the slight problem with his work is that he was a massive, massive howling racist. I mean, he was. I make what I hope is a persuasive case that writing Kipling off as a kind of white supremacist bastard is to underread him badly. Yes. But to write Henty off as a white supremacist bastard, I'm afraid, is to get him about right. And his work therefore has, I think, sort of rightly fallen out of favor. But he was. I read like Max Hastings, who's a generation older than us, describing how he read a lot of Henty in his childhood. So he was knocking around really right up until the kind of 40s and 50s. Well,
you could see those books in second-hand bookshops.
Yeah,
20 years or so ago, there would be a row.
Exactly,
of them.
He was still current, and I think Willard Price is someone I loved as a in my own childhood. The adventure series, Lion Adventure and Amazon Adventure and South Seas Adventure and stuff like that. He's a really sort of lineal descendant of Henty. I mean, he's not quite as kind of obviously problematic as Henty, but he's kind of problematic in the sense it's a very homosocial world. The kind of native peoples of the places to which his characters go on adventures are, basically played for laughs or othered in various ways that we would now find unacceptable. But Henty's stories are kind of interesting of their time, I think, because they show you at that point, what would, go back to the Calvinists, what were you trying to do with children's literature? For a while, we were trying to save children's souls. And then, as a Marxist critic would say, in the 19th century, a lot of it was about, interpolating young boys as, useful imperial subjects. And that the idea was that you would be encouraged to, think of the adventures you could have by going and starting a kind of ranch in Peru or Lima or wherever it was. So Henty's part of the story. I've got to say, one of the dismaying things, and I always knew when I wrote this book that I'd probably end up with having to thread a line between people saying this book is disgraceful because it's not woke enough, and this book is disgracefully woke. Is that right up? I knew that G.A. Henty, and that the early 20th century writers were, would express racial and sexual and gender attitudes that don't chime with our own. But right up to the 1980s, I was finding stuff that was, what we would now would go, yeah, I'm not sure about that. Which again is part of the story, because I think there's a lag, children's writers are generally writing the versions of childhood they imagine. They're drawing on their memories. So it's their own childhood. There's always a sort of 20, 30, 40-year lag in the social attitudes built in. But also the readerships of these books were, from most of the 20th century up until most of the 20th century, they were white middle-class children, because those were the ones who were most likely to be educated to read. And it was a much more racially homogenous society. And Africa and India and South America and America were places that were over there. On the map, they were othered because they were other. And, children's literature is all about going off into the strange and fantastical and wonderful. And for a lot of its history, the rest of the world was strange and fantastical and wonderful. And it was lions and tigers and bears, oh my. And likewise, the people who lived there were strange and exotic, and they were treated as strangely and exotic, just as their customs and the, flora and fauna of those places was. So that's changed, but it took a long time to change.
There's an interesting question about how much children are influenced by what they read, because, I was a literary editor. Currently, you are literary editor of The Spectator. I was writing a feature about, it must have been some anniversary of the famous five, and I read all of them in sequence. And the hilarious thing is they have about 12 summer holidays without getting any older. There's a few Easter holidays in there as well, maybe a Christmas holiday. But reading them as an adult, there is quite a lot of this. Have you seen those funny foreigners who have just arrived in the village? I don't like the look of them. They're clearly up to no good. And then, we have this idea that children are going to, absorb this stuff and think that way. But I really don't think I did. I think I screened that out. I think it sort of wasn't visible to me, but maybe I'm kidding myself.
I wonder. It makes me think a little bit of Jack Black in Viz. If you read Viz, it's a sort of Enid Blyton parody. It's the character called Jack Black, who's always going to have summer holidays with his Aunt Meg. And he always spots someone who looks funny in the village and investigates them. But of course, he always turns out to basically be a little fascist.
Right.
So it's kind of, it's, he rounds up.
I think Julian is very suspect, actually. At the end of reading all of them, he's quite authoritarian. You have meet little Anne, who's basically a servant. George, as you point out, people say, is she trans? But actually the most daring thing at the time was to think that she was a lesbian. That was quite sort of, George,
I think that's us reading it, reading our own preoccupations into it. My sort of argument about George is that actually she kind of increases the book's, as it were, heteronormativity. Because, I don't think Enid Blyton would have had a concept of transness. No, I think Blyton would have thought of her as a tomboy.
Yes.
And sort of semi-approved that, but it also makes her, it's like the funny thing about her is.
Yes. Yes. And Julian, as I say, he's the bossy one, and Dick is this sort of little follower. So, I just felt I had entirely different ideas of the books, but they're still rattling good reads, and I could see why I was so addicted to them as a child, why I sort of couldn't stop. One more chapter.
She does have. As I think I say in the book, her prose is a lot less interesting than the prose of a lot of other. The sort of sentence by sentence, she's not doing much, but. As in this, as in, I think, almost all genre or popular fiction, if you go and look at the sentences and make sort of snooty literary critical judgments on them, you're sort of missing what makes them work. It's like all those reviews that say, look at Dan Brown's gauche sentence or badly constructed. It's all about plotting and pacing. And, Blyton was kind of good at that. As you say, one more chapter.
If you look at Dan Brown, I mean, they're quite short chapters, and they always end
at the end of every one. It's a cheap trick, but it works. And I think acknowledging that it works is, and I think with Enid Blyton, as with Dan Brown, the least interesting thing to do is to point out their badness. The question is why, when there's a lot of bad writing available, are these the ones that succeed?
Now I have something here. This is a beautiful new edition of.
Lovely! Yes, it's been republished, hasn't it? For an anniversary.
It is. Yes, I think it's out sort of yesterday or something like that. With the illustrations by Peter Boston, Lucy M. Boston, the author. And really, I've been to that house. I don't know whether you have. It's the most extraordinary place to visit.
Did you have to get there by boat?
I didn't have to get there by boat, but what an amazing beginning. The railway station called Pennysoke, and somebody arrives in a boat to kind of row them up to the house.
Amazing, downbeat, almost noirish thing of him on the train, just looking out the window at the rain.
Yeah.
Normally kids' books jump straight in with something exciting and lively, and this was very remarkable atmosphere in that book, I think.
But you can kind of tell something's going to happen. Yeah. And with the grandma, again, you've got that dual focus, haven't you? I mean, read it as you're older and you're getting much more into Mrs. Oldknow territory. And what you were saying before about the poignancy, he makes friends with these children and he doesn't quite understand that they're ghosts.
Yeah.
And we can read, what's happening on different levels anyway. I always chose to believe that they were indeed ghosts. And there's a point where he's sort of asking his grandmother or his great grandmother possibly about them, and she sort of has to say, well, they died.
Yeah.
They died when they were young,
But also the sense in which he's somewhat reincarnated.
Yes.
There's that kind of l'éternel retour thing going on. And I'm reading some people writing about Green Nose saying it's this very benign and lovely place. And I find that book wonderfully, thrillingly kind of unheimlich. I mean, the children are not malevolent in any way at all, but it's got a real spookiness to it. Partly that terrifying tree in the climax.
Oh, yes, Green Noah.
Green Noah himself. But also, there's that bit, isn't there, where he finds a little model of the house.
Green Noah?
Oh, yes, Green Noah. That's a good picture.
Yes.
But he finds a little model of the house, doesn't he? And there's a sort of, I think there's a recent ghost horror movie that has the same thing. If there's a sort of house within the house. And he can see his own bedroom, and and
there's things in the house that are in the house. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. It's a sort of recursive. I mean, it's a really extraordinarily atmospheric book. It's very, very haunting, appropriately.
Yes. So it's set in the house that she lived in, and she decided to almost haunt her own house.
Yeah.
And there are, you can go around. I was actually invited by Diana Boston, who married Peter Boston, who was the son of Lucy M. Boston, and sort of had a walk round, had tea with her in the garden, and they have the topiary, I think it's chess pieces or something, and then you can go in and see things like the Witch Ball and the Knights Hall and everything. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. Just one of my favorite.
Do you have to make a special appointment, or do they do tours?
They do tours, actually. And I mean, I was there. I was actually writing something about it. Of course, I should say we are coming up to Christmas. We are now in November. This is a lovely Christmas book. Do you remember The Partridge and the Pear Tree? That the grandma actually sort of goes through, the carol, and because Tolly, again, this poignancy, he's this very lonely child. In a way, these little ghosts have been his only friends.
Yeah.
and yet they're dead. You know, I mean, there's just so many.
There's a lot going on in that book.
There's a ridiculous amount going on.
I think I wrote much more about it than it ends in the finished version of the book.
I mean, there are sequels as well, and some of them I don't think work quite so well. There's one very black magic one, An Enemy at Green No, very scary, and there's one called The Chimneys at Green No, which has a little girl ghost, and she's blind. So I mean, Lucy,
is that the second one?
I think it is.
I think it is. Yeah,
it's beautifully done. I'm not sure Tolly is in it. I can't really remember it that well, but I remember the little blind girl ghost. Lucy M. Boston really knew how to pile it on.
Yeah, no, I think she's extraordinary. I mean, and that it's so interesting, that thing of place suddenly comes in so strongly, and I think in that period, weirdly, you know, my way of looking at it is sort of post-war. When I say post-war housing crisis, but that there is a sort of, I mean, there's a lot of baked-in nostalgia in children's books, and I think this idea that things have changed, but old houses, you know, Tom's Midnight Garden has the same thing, that, you know, the archetypal place in which these things are set, which used to tend to be, you know, countryside cottage or a manor house, you know, Toad Hall, whatever like that. They, you know, the Second World War did for that. And so you're suddenly into a situation. I think I claim, probably wrongly, that the first mention of a flat in children's literature is Tom's Midnight Garden, you know, because the thing has been broken up into flats, and I think that's kind of going on all over the place.
It's very much a part of the story, isn't it? Well, Lucy Boston, she was such a pioneer in all sorts of ways, because she took on this house, the central core of which is about 1,000 years old. You know, it's a Norman tower with a Georgian, you can see it very clearly, there's a Georgian add-on, you know, there's a Georgian frontage. And she was very early on in terms of restoring things, restoring a house and being sympathetic to the structure. I mean, there's a bit, I think she found a hearth in the garden and sort of had it brought back into the, you know, chimney pot.
So rather like someone I know you admire as I do, Alan Garner.
Yes.
Yeah, Alan's. Yeah, you know, it was like, I've got a medieval manor house that's going to have a plumbed on some ancient timbers from another house nearby, and it's sitting on the top of a Stone Age burial mound. There's, you know, children's writers honour the past, which makes sense to me, because time is such a theme in so many of these books.
This is sort of the 60s, I have a feeling. So, you know, you have all the sort of grooviness going on elsewhere, and Lucy M. Boston is patiently restoring a house and like not covering it in groovy psychedelic wallpaper. You know? Yeah,
all that 60s grooviness doesn't really make much of an impact on children's literature as far as I can see. I mean, obviously it spills into The Magic Roundabout and Mr. Ben on television years later.
Maybe things become dated if they're too much in the present day. They then date quite quickly. I mean, to sort of leap ahead a bit, you couldn't cover everything. You couldn't cover every trend, even in 550 pages.
No, and I mean, have been for a year and a half or 2 years in permanent agony on I should have put X in, I should have put Y in, I didn't get Z in. I mean, the book it does have omissions. And it couldn't not. Some of them are shaming, some of them are inevitable, but I have a sort of fantasy that one day I'll get to revise an expanded edition in which I'll do right by the people I left out.
Well, I can kind of see why some people are left out, because they're represented by somebody else. So I think Wolves of Willoughby Chase I would put in.
Yeah, Joan Aiken is actually almost top of the list of people who should have been in there but weren't. I mean, I did think at one point of having a chapter. I'd try and put her and maybe Rosemary Sutcliffe together to talk about.
Oh yes, Rosemary Sutcliffe.
Historical fiction and place again.
And the other one I would say Leon Garfield and Smith, which I think is a utterly wonderful novel. Have you read Smith?
I haven't actually, no. Though I think I did read some Leon Garfield when I was a kid.
He did great ghost stories, actually.
Yes, I think it was the ghost stories I read.
Spooky ghost stories. There's one set on a train. Yes, Smith is sort of, it's a gateway drug to Dickens and actually Fielding. It's sort of 18th century, this a pickpocket who witnesses a murder, a young boy. Funny enough, this sort of takes me back. There's a really crucial part in your book, which is the 1908 Children's Act, which changes the status of children. And there's an extraordinary line in your book where you say it's I can't read my own writing. Oh, it abolished the death penalty for children. Now, probably children hadn't been executed for 100 years or more, but I mean, extraordinary. Yeah. That changed the status of children.
You see, I sometimes think that having that sanction, even if you never use it, would be an advantage in parenting. But
yes, wow. So yeah, it seems quite late, doesn't it? 1908 to say that children.
I mean, it's also I was sort of fascinated. I mean, there were lots and lots of children acts, and not being a legal or social historian, I found myself kind of picked. Oh God, there's another one, and this is a factory act. Oh, this is another factory act. But what were kind of extraordinary when you read them? The provisions often were sort of like, I didn't even realise that was illegal at that point. Or they'd say things like, okay, the legal smoking age is now being raised to 8 or whatever. There were all sorts of weird.
Yes, there's one about the drinking age, isn't there?
It's sort of fascinating what was in place before these things came along. I mean, it really was pretty much the Wild West out there until the late 19th, early 20th century.
Maybe the legal acts they lag quite a long way behind actual practice. But
you'd hope so.
You would. I mean, the thing about children shouldn't drink before they're 5 years old.
Yes, or they can't go to a brothel unattended.
So really all those unicorns and fairies are not that strange after all when you consider the actual life of children. So what I'm just looking at my list of things. Oh yes, there's a very poignant thing about Frances Hodgson Burnett. I think again my writing is terrible. When she meets a policeman as a child.
Oh, yeah.
And the policeman, I mean, there's a thing with adults that they might make a joke to a child, and to a child it is very far from being a joke, and it could in fact haunt you for the rest of your life.
Yes, I thought that was very telling, that bit. It's from her memoir, which is called The One That I Knew Best of All. The one I knew best of all being the child I knew best of all, i.e. herself. And I've seen certain mentions of it I've seen here and there, because it's not a very well-known book now, and I don't know if it's even still in print. People have written it off as sort of saccharine, and I don't think it is. I think it's really extraordinary. You can read the precision with which she's remembered her own childhood, which is true of a lot of successful children's writers. As I say, childhood is for a lot of them unfinished business, and their own childhood is very strong in their mind. And it describes her because I'm walking in the park and there's kind of keep off the grass sign. And she's nervous about the keep off the grass sign. And she asked the policeman about it. And he said, well, if you were to step on the grass, I should have to take you up. By which I think means place you under arrest. And he's just joshing with her, and she is mortified, aged 4, and terrified, and imagines being taken up by this policeman, and presumably we can be fairly certain didn't walk on the grass. But then she also describes how, because she had a mid-Victorian childhood, I guess. Trying to think what her dates were, but she's sort of born, I guess, the early to middle 19th century. Kids were dropping like flies in those days. Death was much, much more usual. And she describes seeing a classmate's body and her father's body and her father's death. And she describes, again, with absolute, I have no reason to doubt her, these things not making nearly as much of an impression on her as the keep off the grass sign. That funny upside down world that Alice's Adventure in Wonderland, strange though it is, captures of, the proportions are all shot to hell. Adults have a very firm idea of priorities and fears, and children's fears are vast and irrational and not always fixed on the things that adults think they should be.
It reminded me of a time when I would have been under 10 and we went to see somebody down in Southend, a relative, probably a great uncle, and he drove a taxi. And we all piled into the taxi coming back from the beach, going to his house. And he turned the meter on and said to me, "You'll have to pay this."
Oh, no.
And I spent the whole time utterly terrified. I had such a tiny amount of pocket money and I just saw this thing clicking on and on. And I mean, people who know me would know I'll do anything rather than take a cab. I don't even take, living in London, if I take one cab in 5 years or even 10 years, that'll be about, even when you could claim it on expenses, there's just something utterly terrifying to this day to watch that meter go round. Even if you go, well, it's only a tenner, I can afford it. In a way, I've never got over that joke.
Yeah. Well, I can still remember being traumatized at age 2 or 3. My dad was an actor in his early career, and I was taken, I must have been 3 or 4 or something, to see him in Gawain and the Green Knight. And there was a great clap of thunder and the lighting all went green. And I can't remember if it was my father's head that was struck off in a very impressive special effect, or I think it was his friend who played the Green Knight who had his head struck off on stage. And, the entire performance more or less had to stop because my screaming caused me to be kind of carried out of the theatre past rows and rows of people. So these things make a big impression, which is another reason that children's literature is so important, I think, to me, because the books you read as a child make a profound impression on you, don't they? I mean, that's one thing that I think the crazed Calvinists and the Rousseauians alike can agree on, that this stuff matters because children are impressionable. That what you give children does shape the way they see the world.
And I should also say that, we've talked about ghosts and houses and middle-class children, with their lashings of ginger beer and so on. But the picture now is very, very different. So you spend a lot of time talking about Mallory Blackman and the sort of there has been a sea change. I mean, stories are just so much more diverse now. I read YA, I review YA, and I'm interested in how sort of sexual things have become. Things are now, books are about teenage pregnancy and having sex for the first time and all this kind of thing. And one of the things I think we have as adults towards children's literature, we were laughing at the Puritans earlier on.
Yeah.
But there's also a sort of, are they putting ideas into impressionable kids' heads? It's always a sight of some kind of unease, isn't it? When there's
I think so. I mean, I would say my account sort of stops not that long after the millennium. So I didn't do, and I don't think I'll know half as well as you what's going on in YA now. And I stopped partly because, the sort of Harry Potter, Philip Pullman moment seemed to be a big inflection point of the genre, and partly because the canon today is still too fluid to really start pronouncing on. And partly because I didn't really want to write about David Walliams. I really didn't want to get mired in the YA cancel culture wars.
Right.
This was a history rather than a present day thing. But I think that, I mean, my instinct is to think that if, children don't need ideas putting in their heads, and if they get ideas, it's much more likely to be from the internet and their friends at school than it is from anything they'll read from the bookshop. But the starting point for that, I think, is Judy Blume, who I came to. I have to say, I was kind of like, okay, I have to write about Judy Blume because I know that she was a big deal among girls of my generation, absolutely avidly reading Judy Blume. And I thought it's going to be a slog, and it's going to be all girly stuff and periods. And Judy Blume's amazing. And she is such a badass. And what I found fascinating about Judy Blume is I thought these were very sort of aggressive, big issue, right, we're going to write about sex. And that's what this book's all about. And then you found actually all the stuff that she did that shocked her contemporaries was the stronger because it was done in such an offhanded way. In that she was saying, I want to represent children or young adults or teenagers' lives to them as they actually are, rather than as adults kind of romantically imagine they should be. And that means doing it in the round. So, I mean, the notorious instance, there's a lovely bit where she was sort of on Crossfire with, I think, Pat Buchanan, some kind of foaming at the mouth, socially conservative paleocon. And it was over her novel Deanie, which is about a girl who's got scoliosis and who's got a pushy mother who wants her to be a model, and her ideas are different. And there's a sentence or two in Deanie where it's about masturbation, female masturbation. She goes to bed and said, I pressed my little button that makes me feel nice and warm and cuddly or whatever it was, and went to sleep. And it was, you're writing about masturbation in this book. And she said, this isn't a book about masturbation. It's a book about a girl with scoliosis, Mr. Buchanan. There's only one sentence in this book about masturbation. Why are you particularly hung up about masturbation? He says his face growing purple. And so I think maybe we should take our cue from Judy Blume, which is to say, if this is the stuff that teenagers and young adults are experiencing, it is not only okay, but a good idea to write about it. And I think, the notorious novel Judy Blume wrote about sex. Oh God! Now what's it called? I've lost my mind. The novel about underage sex. Can't remember. Forever. Is that again? It's really it's not a moralizing book. It doesn't tell a story in a way where, as previous generations of children's stories had, the girl does something wrong and is punished for it. It's they have sex, they're sort of in love with each other, then they realize they're not, then they feel a bit awkward about it, then they go their separate ways in an awkward way, which I think is probably a pretty much, truthful, or as truthful as she could manage, account of how it is for a lot of children. And she all along had to fight against the book banners and the book burners and the challenged lists on libraries. And I think those battles have to be refought in every generation. But I don't know how much, and you can maybe tell me, maybe some YA stuff now is going further than some adults would find comfortable. Again, I'd have thought the internet would be going further than that.
Yes, I mean, it's hard to tell when you're reviewing it, because I would review it when I used to write a column about YA, and I was addressing parents. I wasn't, it's the FT. I didn't really think that maybe 14-year-olds would be picking up the FT. So, and I remember it's quite a few years ago, but I remember I would signal if there was a lot of swearing, because eventually, we got up to and including the C word. There came a point where it was alluded to and you knew what the word was, but it wasn't in the book. Yeah. And then, of course, we leap that, and then it is in the book. So I would just make some kind of reference to this. And then I was at some book events, children's book event, and met some actual YA teenage readers, and they were like, who cares? We're not shocked about that even remotely. So I stopped.
Well, I think isn't it also the case that, the idea, again, it's still baked into the way we think about children, of childhood innocence. That post-romantic hangover still hasn't left us. And I think very often when adults are policing what they think of as suitable for children, what they're really policing is their own conception of childhood, a sort of idealization of childhood. And Mallory Blackman, who, she's most famous for the Noughts and Crosses series, but she's wrote one book whose title I now forget, which is about a boy who has a one-night stand with a girl. I think he's 15 or 16, and she basically shows up and gives him a baby and buggers off.
Yes.
And it's about how he learns to become a single dad as a teenager. And it's a wholly kind of admirable book. Not prurient at all. It's quite serious, but it's got a very unpleasant kind of queer bashing scene in it. It's got a lot of stuff that some adults think are unsuitable for children. And Blackman, in her autobiography, says, she wrote a lovely memoir called Just Saying. She says, look, I've been challenged endlessly by parents saying, this isn't suitable for children. And she said, I've never had one of my readers challenge me on that stuff. And I think, whether we like it or not, our children are probably pretty well exposed to this stuff. That said, I wouldn't be wild if my teenage daughter was reading some book all about how you should choke each other during sex. No doubt those books are out there.
Yes, another one, again, it's sort of beyond your end point of the Haunted Wood, but there was the Melvin Burgess of incredibly gritty stuff.
I remember that when Junk came out and the Daily Mail campaigned against it.
Yes, exactly.
But there was Zamo on Grange Hill, was on heroin as well.
Well, I think there's sort of something else that I objected to in one book, which was not... it was a pretty gruesome subject matter, including sort of murder and torture and all this sort of thing. But actually what I really didn't like was a female character who just had no agency whatsoever. And at one point she's sort of taken away and kidnapped. And it didn't go into it, but she's obviously repeatedly raped. And that's the idea of this particular book. I can't remember which it was. And then she gets rescued by the boy. And it was more that I objected to.
Well, I think there's every reason to object to that. In comic book, because comics are part of the story of children's reading. I don't go into them deeply because they're sort of a different thing, but they were a big part of my own childhood reading. I think probably in comic book discourse, it's known as fridging.
Fridging
is that if a girl is chopped up and put in the fridge so that the boyfriend comes home and opens it, finds the parts of it, is that when the job of a woman is to be traumatized or murdered, in order to give the male character some motivation for revenge or rescue. That's not cool. And there's been a lot of good work done by feminist fans on comic book tropes which are not cool. And Alan Moore, who I think both of us also admire, has been more criticized for his work on Batman: The Killing Joke, in which Barbara Gordon is raped and paralyzed by the Joker. As unfortunately that idea that damsels exist to be in distress is a toxic one that has gone through a lot of children's literature.
Yes, it's almost like the Bechdel test for kids' books.
Exactly.
Well.
I think encouragingly, there is a lot of there'll always be bad books and there'll always be misogynistic books, but there's kind of quite a good deal of good female agency in children's literature these days. I think people are much more conscious of it, and that's been going on actually for a while. As you said, you get Bossy Julian and the Famous Five, but you can look at quite a lot of other sort of mid-century and later 20th century children's literature, and the sisters are doing it for themselves.
Well, we could go on and on and on talking about your book, The Haunted Wood, A History of Childhood Reading, but I think we'll draw to a close with my 3 questions, and one of them is a terrible thing to ask a literary editor, as you are and I have been. But the first question is, what is your favourite artwork? And you can interpret that as widely as you like.
Well, I'm almost a complete Philistine with regards to the visual arts, and I'm profoundly ignorant. But the one I sort of lit on as a slight cheat is Rodin's Gates of Hell, because I love Rodin. I think, whenever I've been in a room with Rodin sculpture, I just extraordinarily kind of strong response to the beauty and sensuality of his work. But the Gates of Hell is great because it's a kind of an anthology. You get the thinker, and you get the kiss in there for free.
Bronze door, is that the idea?
It's an enormous door. Yeah, it's a sort of Dante illustration. I think it's in the Louvre, but anyway, it's just lots and lots and lots of Rodin sculptures all around. So you get a whole bunch of Rodin for your money.
His greatest hits.
His greatest hits, exactly.
Perfect, good choice. Now here is the embarrassing question to throw at a serving lit ed. But as I say to people, you don't spend all your time reading when you're a lit ed. You probably read less than if you weren't a lit ed. I'm sure I read more now than when I was actually editing books pages. But so this is the Book of Shame, and I'm not advocating literal shame, but I'm just saying, is there something that people would go, wow, Sam Leith hasn't read that?
Well, yeah, there'd be too many to count, probably. I mean, as you know, if you're a lit ed, your reading career is a weird one, because you might well be, I am, maybe you are, as an English graduate, so you kind of read the canon for A-level and university, and you get as much of the classics under your belt as you can. But then once you're working as a literary journalist, almost everything you read is something that's been published in the last month.
Yeah.
So you have a huge, if you haven't read, I don't know, Elizabeth Bowen or Graham Greene,
you're not going to, or
you're not going to anytime soon. So there's a bunch of things that I haven't read. I mean, I think my most shocking one is probably anything by Virginia Woolf. Now, I've read about 1.5 books by Virginia Woolf, in the sense that I've read the first half of The Waves and the first half of The Lighthouse and the first half of Mrs. Dalloway, but I have never been able to get through a Virginia Woolf novel. And I know it's a failing on my part, but I can't be doing with her. And I everybody has blind spots, and that's one of mine. I'm afraid. Maybe it's the comma splices.
That's a right. Okay. Oh yes.
I'm properly ashamed, and I'm aware that, as I say, it's not. That's a good one. It's me.
That's a good one. I can't remember who it was, but somebody didn't read Dickens. And actually, I think it was Daniel Rachel didn't like Shakespeare, but he'd read about 20 plays, and he said, "Still don't like him. Still don't like. Just don't like him."
I mean, that's a good admission to make. I do like Shakespeare, and I've read quite a lot of Dickens, though not all of Dickens. I mean, who
not
has,
all of Dickens,
except for Robert Douglas Fairhurst.
Well, actually, I've read everything but the Pickwick Papers, because I sort of had some idea it wasn't really a novel, so I couldn't really be bothered with it. And I think
short though.
Is it short?
Yeah, I don't think it's as long as the others.
Okay.
When it's kind of Hard Times length rather than David Copperfield length.
Right. Okay. Well, it's time to do it. I'm vowing to do it now, and then I will have read pretty much all of Dickens.
Good God, you haven't read the journalism though.
Oh, I have. I've read a selection of the journalism. A selection. I mean, he edited Household Words for donkey's ears, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, Michael Slater's done a selection of the journalism, hasn't he? I think.
I just did the Penguin selection, and some of it's absolutely great. And to talk about the child in the man, he has an amazing account of being lost, aged 10 years old. So this would be about 1822, 1823, which takes him into the era of the Romantics, and he wanders through London on his own, age 10. I mean, it's a really extraordinary
he carried on, though, isn't it? Wandering through London on his own. But he sort of shadows this book in a funny way, because all through the Victorian period, you go, okay, Dickens didn't write any children's books, but his portrayal of childhood and his ideas about childhood, I think, was inevitably hugely influential on the people who did.
And it's, it's sort of pre-Freud, but he's got something, hasn't he, about things like the impact of the blacking factory. He sort of understands those fears. He obviously went through incidents as a child that completely marked him. And we could now sort of psychoanalyze him for that. It's quite amazing. He is lost by the person that he's with roundabout. I don't think Trafalgar Square existed, but roundabout the Strand. Yeah. And he ends up all the way, I think, in Hoxton. And goes into a music hall, and finally, I mean, he goes to a cab shelter, and the family have been searching desperately for him, or the person he was with has been, going to every cabman's shelter. And I think he's found somewhere around Lincoln's Inn. He wanders back. So I've read, I haven't read all of the journalism, but I've read a good selection and the Christmas books and all that kind of thing. So
props to you.
Pickwick Papers is next. I've actually been commissioned to write something about it. So that's the other thing that we do, isn't it? We get commissioned and go, no, I will read that.
Yeah, well, that's the treat, isn't it? That gives you, exactly. You're on the clock
then. Funniest or most bizarre feedback on any aspect of your work that could be, even editing, literary pages, or anything?
Well, there's one that sticks out in my mind. I mean, any author knows what it's like to get what feels like an unmerited 1-star Amazon review. I mean, it hurts even more to get a merited 1-star Amazon review. But as one of my last book, or not last book, but one of my previous books, which is about rhetoric. And I got this 1-star Amazon review, which read, I should just go to my alt tab to reread it. It said, 1 star, overpowering new car smell, book probably okay. So this is not about the book's contents, but it's disturbing new car smell, so strong that it woke me up having the book on the bedside table. Printer? What the hell?
Wow.
Nobody else has complained of my books smelling of new cars. But anyway, there we are.
Some people love that. Some people
I would quite like
want a new car.
If you smell what my car smells like, you'd think a new car smell would be a great improvement on that.
Extraordinary. Well, again, to go back to being a litter, do you remember how art books would be overpowering, actually? If you have a shelf
they're like glossy stock.
Yeah, and you're sort of, going past the art book shelf and quick, I must send them all to Tim Hilton or
yes, get them out of here.
Get them out of here. It's been brilliant talking to you, Sam. We have been talking about The Haunted Wood. Look at it again. It's fabulous. And also the print is it's not large print, but it's not tiny print. So actually you do whiz through it.
It's intended to be quite navigable. Also, I should say,
doesn't smell of new cars.
Doesn't smell of new cars. I nearly insisted that we put on the kind of early chapters, which I was dealing with all these rather kind of austere Puritans, like, if you don't dig this stuff, Winnie the Pooh is 40 pages on,
just around the corner.
Turn
just
to page
around
84.
the corner.
So you're allowed to skip, readers.
Yeah. It's a good story to go straight through, with many interesting ideas, developing ideas about children and children's literature. But also you might want to just go straight in and read about Tolkien or J.K. Rowling or Alan Garner. And that's permitted as well, isn't it?
Absolutely.
You're allowed. Well, thank you very much for joining me in the book bag. I shall bid you adieu, and I will see you anon, I hope.
Thank you. Well, I hope it's au revoir anyway. All right.
Au revoir. Ta-ta. Bye-bye. And thank you very much for watching. Join me again next time. Again, we've been talking about The Haunted Wood. It's published by One World, thoroughly recommended. So I shall see you again soon with another fabulous author to chat to. Goodbye.